of April this year.
Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, can I just deal with this issue and ask the Minister to clarify a few points around the approved issuer levy abolition, effectively, bringing the approved issuer levy to a zero rate, which is like abolishing it, except leaving the framework there. It's not going to be applied. Mr. Chairman, the report of the Labor Party and the minority report from Select Committee noted that there was no good evidence that this was going to increase the rate of flow of funds available to New Zealand lenders, nor that it was necessarily going to decrease the cost of borrowing in New Zealand. And we are sticklers for the evidence, Mr. Bridges, and no, it's actually an assessment of the evidence that was given. Mr. Chairman, around the world, governments are running deficits in part because they have hugely decreased the taxation that is paid by the wealthiest of people in the world who move capital around between jurisdictions and somehow manage to avoid paying much, if any, tax. Given that this was a very small impost, effectively upon the rate of return that was being received by overseas lenders into New Zealand, the Labor Party is not convinced that that tax burden that was effectively being paid by foreign lenders into New Zealand was wrong. I pay tax. Everyone else in New Zealand pays tax. Why shouldn't people who benefit from the New Zealand economy settings, from our police force, from the fact that we have an enforceable rule of law, from the fact that we have an educated and healthy population who are educated through a system that is paid for by taxation and health services that are paid for by taxation, all of which increases the capability of the New Zealand economy to pay the interest, which is the reward that overseas lenders in New Zealand receive. Now, I've got no problem with those overseas lenders being rewarded for lending money to New Zealand, but I do think that there is as good a case for them contributing to the finances of New Zealand as other people. And to zero rate the approved issuer levy when there was no good evidence that this would have an effect that was measurable on either the available liquidity coming into New Zealand or the rate of interest paid by New Zealanders. And I think we got to the conclusion, I know that we reached the conclusion in the Labor Party that it was just bad policy. Mr. Chairman, New Zealand has a multi-billion-dollar deficit. That deficit is effectively funded by the government borrowing money, indeed, in part, borrowing more money from overseas investors who are being given a lower tax or effectively cost or tax burden through the zero rating of the approved issuer levy. And so I ask the Chairman to tell the House what is the evidence that the approved issuer levy going down to 0% will reduce either interest rates or increase liquidity into New Zealand. And if there is no good evidence, why is it that the government with a multi-billion-dollar deficit is giving up on that revenue? There were claims that the approved issuer levy was easily avoided. Well, the answer to that is to close the avoidance mechanisms, not to reduce it to zero. If we were to reduce all taxes to zero just because some people avoid them rather than closing the loopholes, we wouldn't have a health system, we wouldn't be able to pay the police, and we wouldn't be able to educate our population. The appropriate response to the fact that the approved issuer levy wasn't being paid by everyone because there were ways around it that were legal but were known would be to close the loopholes. And so I asked the Minister why the loopholes weren't closed, but rather the easier option that was taken to decrease the approved issuer levy to zero. Can I also ask the Minister, and this is an area where I'm admitting ignorance or less knowledge than I should have, are the people who are receiving the approved issuer levy all paying non-resident withholding tax on all of the interest that is paid to them by New Zealand institutions? Or are they, through the approved issuer levy route, able to avoid their non-resident withholding tax obligations? Because if they are able to avoid their non-resident withholding tax obligation, Mr Chairperson.
Seeing another call, Honourable David Parker.
Very brief call because I've finished this point, sir. If they are able to avoid paying non-resident withholding tax on the interest that is paid to them by New Zealand borrowers who are lending money from international lenders, if they're not paying non-resident withholding tax through the approved issuer levy route, then that further reinforces the fact that the approved issuer levy, rather than being abandoned completely, should have had the loopholes tightened and to ensure that there is a reasonable return to the New Zealand authorities to help fund the very services that the overseas lender relies upon in order for them to be paid their interest, i.e. enforcement of the rule of law, education and health services and a healthy economy that those lenders benefit from. That, sir, is the end of this contribution.
Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
By no